Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Marc Glendening. I'm heading up the Institute's Cultural Affairs unit. This is the second episode of our new free speech series, and the focus today will be on the situation in Scotland, because the SNP government are in the process of passing a new hate crime and public order law that will have enormous repercussions for freedom of speech. It breaks very dangerous new ground. For example, private conversations could become things that are subject to criminal prosecution. And the Law Commission is recommending that this provision be extended to the whole of the United Kingdom. Today, our guest is Dr. Stuart Waiton, who is a long-standing and very prominent campaigner for freedom of speech in Scotland. He is one of the leaders of the Free to Disagree campaign, together with Jim Sillars, the former deputy leader of the SNP. Stuart teaches criminology and sociology at the University of Abertay in Dundee. He is the author of many books on this subject, including Snob's Law, Criminalizing Football Fans in an Age of Intolerance. I'm going to start by asking Stuart, before we come on to the specifics of the SNP's new legislation, what is really driving him on this issue? Why have you devoted so much energy and time over years to campaigning for free speech? What is the sort of underlying philosophy you're operating from on this?
Good question. I think if you'd asked me this a few years ago, I might have given you a different answer. So it's interesting to think about. I suppose my main concern that I think about at the minute is the idea of the new elites. So who runs society? And increasingly, part of the framework of how society appears to be run is that we're moving to a situation where the state treats the public. In general, there are specific groups, but in general, I think it treats the public as being vulnerable and in need of protection. And that now is seen as good practice in institutions, in law, and so on. And so within that framework, my concern is that we now see a vulnerability to words. Right? So I even look up, so if you look up, for example, the term racial abuse, right, you'd think that that might have existed for all time, but actually it's something that's come into existence really from the 1980s. And it's interesting that you use the term abuse, right? Because when I think of abuse, I think of something like child abuse, and I think of something physical. But racial abuse increasingly is simply about words. And I think the race issue is key as a kind of Trojan horse for how this, what we're looking at has developed. Because once we accept that we need to protect certain ethnic minorities from certain words and terms and so on, then the question is, well, why don't we protect other people? And in fact, why don't we protect everybody? And so there seems to be a kind of collapsing of a modern type of etiquette with past kind of political concerns to do with oppression and inequality that kind of coalesce, come together and lead to, you know, laws, initiatives, practices, a kind of almost a form of morality, you know, that it's good, you're a good person. So I suppose that's where my concerns have developed from, is just constantly looking at, from New Labour really, I suppose, from my work, the emergence of a kind of new political class and a new body of kind of caring professionals and a caring ethos that comes to protect us from more and more and more things. And a key and probably the most worrying aspect of this is around language. because it ends up meaning we need to stop freedom of speech because it's dangerous, damaging, and so on.
So there's no real, it seems to me, the danger of this, of what you're saying, is that if you erode the distinction between a self-regarding and another regarding act, going back to John Stuart Mill, if other regarding becomes defined as the use of words, then in fact there's really no limit to what the state might decide it wants to ban. It might want to turn the whole nation into a sort of enormous safe space in which, you know, fairly mundane or lines of argument you and I, as Democrats, might consider to be fairly mundane and prosaic, but which, if you keep extending the logic of this insanity, then in fact democracy becomes impossible, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the example you use, it's interesting in terms of words and actions. So it's one of the interesting things. I mean, you've got an interest in football, and one of the interesting things in relation to football is the extent to which there's been a shift from what you could argue is a kind of panic around football violence and through hooliganism, to that being almost irrelevant now. You know, there's no talk about violence in football, and even when there is violence, they're more concerned about what was shouted while the violence took place. So you get incidents where people are throwing coins at, I think it was a goalkeeper in Hartlepool, and they don't seem to care about the coins being thrown. They care that he was being called names. So even violence just is an irrelevance. You know, so the guy could have been like lying on the ground, filled up with sharp coins, and you think that the news coverage might still have been man killed with large coins while outrageously called such and such. And obviously I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's not that much, which raises all sorts of questions in terms of not just democracy, as you say, in terms of limits on that, but if words are seen as weapons, where does that not just leave democracy, where does it leave the criminal justice system? Because it turns upside down the framework of how we have thought about what is criminal and what isn't criminal, what we should and shouldn't prioritize.
And it has terrible repercussions, and I'm digressing slightly, but you just provoked a memory talking about the incident at Hartlepool United. It also has huge implications for traditional British humour. So there was, I think, a football match at Falkirk. They were playing, I think, Dunfermline Athletic, and one of the Dunfermline players had only one eye. And so the Falkirk players sort of chucked onto the pitch some sort of comedic, you know, eyeballs you can buy in a joke shop. And the way this was portrayed was as if it was some sort of extraordinarily terrible, you know, traumatic incident for the player concerned, who I suspect probably found it quite amusing. But it's interesting how the culture is now being forcibly changed, whereby quite earthy, traditional British proletarian humor is now seen as something utterly appalling.
Yeah, it's I mean, I suppose that was a thing that really struck me, as always concerned me about the football dimension of it. I mean, I used to go to football as a kid, usually by myself with my mates, when you didn't have seating and you were part of this massive crowd milling around and so on. And, you know, it was a relatively rough, tough, working class environment. And the humor is vicious, you know, vicious. And now that type of language is essentially is criminal. And that is one of my concerns with kind of hate crime frameworks, is that often you are not criminalizing hate, you are criminalizing a section of the population who haven't been to university and learned what is the correct language that is acceptable in modern society. And you know, so they'll use incorrect language, terms, slang, slag-offs. And of course, blokish humour is often a bit not only crude, but kind of cruel. But you have to know that it's not meant. It's like you'll often find, sort of more middle-class people will find it a bit as if there's something wrong with this person. Whereas actually it's just a crude crassness sometimes, which can be quite funny, which is not intended as anything. It hasn't got much behind it. That's my concern. I suppose I think one of the things you're thinking about or interested in is this the extent to which this language has a class dimension to it. And I think that's where there is a real problem, that you end up in a situation where people end up with criminal records in relation to hate, where if you just scratch the surface and actually investigate, there's not hate there. It's not what we think we're looking at. It's a kind of drunken tweet or a kind of unemployed person with mental health problems gibbering on Facebook, or things like that. And then you interview them, they're always embarrassed. They're always ashamed of themselves. They're embarrassed. They're not members of the British National Party or card carrying, whatever it is. It's not what we are being led to understand about society, and which is one of my big concerns, is that we seem to be encouraging an idea that we have a hate-filled society full of people who hate. And I think it's less true than it's probably ever been in terms of the issues that people are looking at.
It also seems to be very hypocritical, because a lot of the people who go on about hate the most and how dreadful hate is are pretty hateful people themselves, and use hateful language, which obviously I defend their right to do, in relation to, say, conservatives or feminists who don't take the transgender line, or Christians. And that's sort of okay. You can retweet, as John McDonnell did when he was Shadow Chancellor, a tweet saying, I hope Esther McVeigh gets killed, or whatever it was. It was something along those lines. And, nothing happens in relation to that. But if a Falkirk football supporter throws a jokey eyeball onto a pitch, then, as you say, the full weight of the law is brought down on them. So I don't often buy this line that these people, these new kind of speech McCarthyites, authoritarians, are really that concerned about the communication of abuse. It's just in relation to certain groups they consider to be sacred, rather patronizingly. But, if it's directed to you or me or somebody they disagree with, then, anything goes. In an interview with the Glasgow Rangers website, you mentioned how illiberal Scotland is becoming, not just regarding what can be communicated, but also in relation to parenting, alcohol, smoking. Every aspect of cultural life, it seems to me, is becoming heavily regulated north of the border. I mean, pretty much as it is south of the border as well. Why are the Scottish political establishment such sort of culture control freaks? I mean, this is meant to be the land of, David Hume, Adam Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment, a society that at one time was associated with very robust discourse, people with very strong-willed people. What do you think has been happening in Scotland to change the culture so dramatically?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this fully explains it. But again, this comes back to my interest in the kind of new elites, for want of a better term. Because I think part of the thing that happened in Scotland, especially the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, it was almost as if you had the birth of a new political class. So whereas in the past, you might have people who are quite liberal and have a tradition of liberalism, or they'll be quite conservative, or they'll be socialist, and any of those isms, any of those sort of belief systems, to a certain extent, start from the premise that people are relatively robust, and the way you resolve things is you discuss and argue with people. So it's more of a kind of traditional approach, whereas the new approach is much more one where you think that what is good is to be watchful and caring. So the term well-being, I think, is really important. Right, so we're concerned about the well-being of people, which isn't specific groups, it's everybody, right? So student well-being, for example, is an absolute obsession in universities, right? Part of the student experience is student well-being, and you'll have emails constantly go out to students about how they can get support for this and support for that, and they should mental health and wellness clinics and various things, so on and so forth. And I think that kind of caring ethos is now an absolute, and you can't really criticize that. If you challenge the caring framework, you're greedy, you're aggressive, you're a bully, you're there's all these terms for how, you know, your sensibility is incorrect. A bit like this viral thing about the council meeting with,
oh yeah, the Hansford Parish Council.
yeah. Right. So basically, as far as when I first watched that, and I don't know the background in detail, but when I first watched that, I thought that's interesting, because what I'm watching is a woman being anti-democratic and using the power of Zoom to usurp elected members. So chairperson starts shouting, "You're out." Vice chair says, "You don't need to vote for a new chair. Read the constitution. You don't know it. You're out." And this kind of nicely spoken, calm woman sort of just basically uses her ability to undermine these people by taking them off Zoom. And yet she is celebrated across the press as a heroine against the bullying men of, you know, and I'm looking at it thinking, well, actually, this is quite autocratic, what's happening here. As far as I can see, they've got a framework for how their democratic processes work. And this individual's just coming in with apparently no authority, as the chair suggests, whether that's true or not. And she's just using Zoom to throw them out of the meeting. And nobody raises a concern about this. The concern that's raised is about nasty, white, old gammon type men who are bullies. And that's the sensibilities. And I think the Scottish Parliament embodies that absolutely. I mean, my experience of going there and talking on these committees is that you have a kind of sock puppet framework where you have all these different professionals and lawyers, human rights lawyers, who all sing from the same caring hymn sheet and find the idea of kind of people's freedom and you promoting the freedom is something that's quite dangerous. Yeah, so they should be free to die with alcohol. You don't care about people dying of cancer, of cigarettes. You don't care about the child abuse of parents smacking their children. You don't care about racism. You know, people can just shout these things. So, and I think that it's more of a purified framework where these new elites, these professional classes, essentially talk to themselves with this caring ethos, a very paternalistic, very illiberal ethos, which they describe as a form of tolerance and modern Scotland and so on. So I think that's why Scotland is ahead of the game, because it's a more purified expression of this type of approach.
No, that's a very interesting analysis. So in a way, I think you're bringing in a kind of public choice economics analysis, whereby this isn't a purely ideological phenomena, but there are a whole series of middle class elites who now actually have a material interest also in ever more extensive governmental intervention. Moving on to the specifics of the hate crime bill, what for you are the most sort of pernicious aspects of this proposed law? I mean, one of the things that struck me researching it is that it's incredibly vague in its drafting. So hate is defined as, quote, prejudice against people because of their identities and protected characteristics. It wants to outlaw abusive behavior without ever defining what abuse means. Behavior that is, quote, likely to stir up hatred. So who's going to interpret these elastically drafted concepts?
Yeah, well, that's one of the problems, because in the bill they try and say, well, you know, this isn't restricting freedom of speech because it's determined in terms of what is reasonable. But of course, what is reasonable is then going to be decided by judges. So essentially, you are giving the power to decide what can and can't be said to judges in terms of reasonableness. And they were going to change quite a number of the specifics of the bill to allow a bit more freedom of speech, but just in the last few weeks they just dropped that. All the discussion, all the concerns that have been raised by lawyers, by the police. I mean, just about every organisation has raised concerns about this, and as far as I can tell, they've just dropped them all now, and so we don't really know where we are in terms of where this is going to go. So essentially, what they've done is they've now, you could be seen as there's the hate crime framework around race. So they've now incorporated, well, we should have this now around age. So that's the kind of new one. Disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. They haven't done the male-female thing yet in terms of men saying things that are sexist and so on. But that is something that they said, well, they might incorporate later, right, without necessarily having a new law, which that I think would be incredibly explosive, because you're talking about, yeah, is someone chatting you up potentially becoming a hit, right? Well, yeah. I mean, you laugh, but that's genuinely.
I know. I'm sort of laughing in a, you know,
the irony. But it's one of the things I worry about most is the criminalization of interpersonal relationships. You know, the extent to which the kind of hashtag believe kind of process becomes normalized, so that young people are educated into understanding that kind of unpleasant, uncomfortable, disagreeable behavior should be seen as criminal and something that you can't really, that is damaging to you. And again, that's a real problem, and it's a difficult discussion, because once you create a culture within which you are educated to know that words damage you, then words potentially start to damage you. That's how you start to interpret, that's how you start to feel that thing. So, you know, so Marcus Rashford can say, yeah, the racist tweet that he got shows you the worst of humanity. As one of my friends said, perhaps he should read a history book if he thinks being called a name on Twitter is the worst of humanity. And me even just saying that, I sort of almost stepped back from saying it, because I think, yeah, how will that be interpreted? You know, are people going to say, I have no sympathy that, you know, this racist language is irrelevant, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And you start to feel the weight of that on your shoulders a little bit in terms of the potential dangers of raising questions.
I mean, didn't Nicola Sturgeon have a big problem with some SNP party members who have resigned in a huff because, according to the original version of the bill, it would actually be technically illegal to be a transgender skeptic, to voice that in public. And they were wanting that to be something which was automatically something that could land you a criminal record. And then I think the SNP slightly kind of rode back from that. But where are the SNP now on that particular issue?
Well, they rode back on it, and now they've ridden back on their riding back. So they're back to where we started. So essentially, so the Hamza Yusuf, who's the justice main man up here, had kind of buckled under the pressure and said, we're going to change this, and we're going to allow discussion, which again, it's remarkable that you have this, we're going to allow this discussion. You know,
that's very big of him, yeah.
The state is telling you that, you know, this discussion is allowed, that one isn't, but this one is. And Nicola Sturgeon put out a little video because lots of young people who joined the SNP, it seems, one of the big issues that they're interested in is the transgender question. And apparently there was tens of thousands of people leaving the SNP because they're into the transgender framework, if you like. And Nicola Sturgeon put out a video trying to plead to them to join the SNP, to come home, while explaining, yes, we're going to allow a bit of discussion on this, but we will not allow transphobia in any form, so on and so forth. And it seems now, from having moved to say that there should be a discussion allowed, they've now moved away from that again and said we're going to have a look at this. So at the minute, I don't know where we are, but I'm working on the assumption that, yeah, it's potentially going to remain something that will be simply illegal, but that will be so explosive.
Well, they'll have to arrest J.K. Rowling if she returns to Edinburgh. I mean,
potentially. I mean, that's where it becomes a bit arbitrary, isn't it? Because I suspect what often happens is the people who get arrested, the people that you don't hear about, who don't have any power or wealth, and so on. And as usual, they'll be the ones that suffer most from this.
What are the implications of this law for the arts, religious freedom of expression, even what can be kept in libraries?
Yeah, well, I think that they were, so within the bill, they said you could prosecute playwrights and even actors. Now that apparently already exists, the playwright framework from the Public Order Act of 1986 in relation to race, but it was very specific in terms of incitement to violence, a kind of quite a fairly rigid framework, which has hardly ever been used. I'm not sure if it's ever been used. But in this one, so that they again threw this in, that if a play could be seen as being hateful, then the producers and also the actors, so this was the first time ever actors who have had no role in writing anything, they're just acting. Actors could be potentially arrested for being in a play that someone has interpreted as being promoting hate. So that's one of the frameworks, which they then backed off from, but I think they might have then again backed off from them backing off. More broadly, in terms of newspapers and universities, there's a clause that allows institutions to be prosecuted. So institutions who don't actively prevent hate could potentially also end up in trouble. So that raises questions with me about the media, for example. So if a newspaper article is written by somebody who attacks Black Lives Matter or attacks part of the equalities framework and so on, or challenges multiculturalism, could that be seen as Islamophobic? Could it be seen as hateful? Are universities going to have to relate to this? So that do they have to burn all their copies of Mein Kampf? Not that I imagine many of them are there, but they should be, because people should be able to read the nonsense that Hitler wrote, or books like that. Clearly, that must be a hate book. But then, of course, there's the whole question of Christianity, right? And so, an article I've just written recently is about a teacher in Edinburgh who is, at the minute, potentially going to be thrown out of the teaching profession because he is a Christian and put out a video where he was quite upfront about opposing gay marriage, seeing gay families as problematic, and so on, and made various points about this. And the teaching council have said that people could interpret what he says reasonably to mean that this teacher would discriminate against pupils who are from certain backgrounds. And as far as I know, there is absolutely no evidence that he ever has discriminated, but his beliefs could allow someone to think reasonably that he would discriminate, which then, as I've said in the article, raises the questions, well, can Christians be teachers then? Should we allow Christians that have certain views to be teachers? Because why should we wait till they express their views if we know they have them? The same argument could apply. That these people with these views we could reasonably think that they would or may discriminate against gay pupils or pupils with gay parents. So should we round up the Christian teachers and throw them out of schools and in fact many other professions because they have a discriminatory perspective, which they do. They do have a discriminatory perspective. And if they acted on that in their profession, they should be thrown out of that profession. But if they do not act on it, it's just a belief that they have, then that absolutely needs to be defended. So, I mean, you can see how far this goes in terms of how it's become an accepted framework for regulating what is and is not acceptable in this more caring kind of society.
Another very sinister aspect of the bill, to my way of thinking, is it being is in relation to it being justified in terms of being necessary for community cohesion. Now, in a pluralist and democratic society, is it really for the state to impose cohesion? Surely politics and democracy are about people giving expression to their differences, albeit peacefully. But when the state gives itself that kind of responsibility, then you're sort of on the road really to a highly authoritarian type of politics, it seems to me. And it's a very dangerous concept, is it not?
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of problems with that. I mean, the first framework is they talk about communities. And so they establish these kind of uniform, concretized identities. So apparently, if you're Black, you're a member of this community. And if you're gay, you're a member of this community. And of course, they are what are called vulnerable communities or vulnerable groups. So, which is interesting because you get examples of gay men, for example, who are particularly aggrieved at being defined as being vulnerable and say, well, I'm not vulnerable. I'm no more vulnerable than anyone else, but actually in law, you are actually vulnerable. And that's, so the communities are quite specific. And it seems quite divisive that it kind of encourages a sense that you are in this community and you are in that community. And then of course you get competing communities. So I had this peculiar experience when I went to one of the early discussions in a community kind of setting about this bill. And there was a disability activist academically who was desperate to explain to our group that people didn't just dislike the disabled. People didn't just have prejudices against the disabled, or people didn't just have ignorance about the disabled. People hate the disabled, she shouted 3 times. They hate the disabled. They hate the disabled. And I went out and looked it up, and of course there is a book called Why Do People Hate the Disabled? Right? And it becomes a framework then, because you need to prove that people hate you, right? And you want to prove people hate you. Your group, your community needs to show hate. And so there becomes almost a competitive drive to encourage the idea that there is hatred everywhere, right? It's hatred to Blacks, it's hatred to disabled, and each kind of, you know, the professional individuals who, as far as I'm concerned, don't represent these people any more or less than I do, end up being the ones who are consulted and brought into Parliament to define their group's interest, their community's interest. But more generally, I think what we're saying is a change in the nature of the state from a state that represents active individuals to a state what's called, it's the politics of recognition. So the role of the state, when you have a vulnerable populace, the role of the state appears to have become one where it says we need to recognize people, we need to recognize their identities, we need to recognize their vulnerabilities, and we need to show that we can. You know, that's the role of the state now, is to recognize these groups. And as much as anything, it's about that attempt by the modern elites and the modern state to kind of connect with these different constructed groups. You know, that they now have these different professional bodies, these little charities, and so on. And there's a kind of the politics of recognition, recognizing your hurt, and being there to protect your well-being, your identity, and so on. That seems to be a key new dimension of the state, I think, which is incorporated in this discussion.
I mean, it also, just listening to you talk, it just struck me that there are parallels, maybe imperfect ones, with the whole kind of pre-war fascist idea of the corporate state, whereby the role of the state was to manage different groups that it constructed and identified as being the different pillars of the society, and that they would be brought together into this coherent community of guilds and professions, who would then be represented by elite members as chosen by the government, who would represent these different sections of society to the state. And so the whole logic of this group-based mentality is antithetical, surely, to liberal democracy, which is predicated on the right of each individual citizen to have a vote and a voice, and to be represented by individuals, you know, we choose to elect on a geographical basis, not on the basis of being, you know, a woman or a member of an ethnic group or a religious, you know, faction or whatever it happens to be. There's something incredibly sinister here, which I suspect, you know, Hamza Yusuf and Nicola Sturgeon and the rest aren't obviously conscious of, or self-conscious about, but they are going down a road which seems to me, ultimately, if you take it to its logical conclusion, does result in the hollowing out of liberal democracy.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I never like using it. People use the term and relate to fascism too much. So, you know, Donald Trump's a fascist, and you know, everyone else is. It's kind of and I tend to think that what we're seeing today is very different. It might have similar results, but it's very different. It's almost like we have a collapse of ideology rather than an enforcement of it, you know, a kind of an emptiness, which is partly why I think you end up having a discussion about cultures, because society can't come to an idea about culture. What is a good culture? What is our culture that we want to defend? And it's become a kind of embarrassment, you know, that you should take the knee if you think that you're going to defend any particular culture, especially a British culture. That's problematic, to say the least. And so you embrace cultures, you embrace diversity and difference. But in that process, you create all sorts of problems, right? Because you end up helping to constitute separation. You know, so you get kind of communities starting to emerge that are more separated from each other, rather than having some kind of unity. Well, both a sense of universalism at the level of the individual, that we're all individuals in a kind of universal sense, but also that we don't have a common culture. We don't have a commonality, things that we collectively should be able to embrace. And I think that's part of the problem, is there's a kind of emptiness to the modern elites, which is why it's more a form of therapeutics than it is ideology in certain aspects of this.
Yeah, I think they're traveling towards an authoritarian postmodern sort of state, but in a way that's very different. You're absolutely right, from the historical context of previous types of anti-liberal politics. The last question I'd like to ask you relates to the way in which the Scottish state, but this is also happening in Britain throughout Britain to some extent, is actually becoming a player in its own right in the political game. So the whole notion that state institutions like the police should be outside of the realm of political contestation seems to be going out of the window. I mean, in Scotland, there's been this extraordinary campaign called, run by the police, called Letters to Scotland, which are highly, I mean, these letters and posters they're putting out are just weirdly phrased, and it's not often quite clear what they mean very specifically, but there's a sort of tone of intimidation there. And it seems to me bizarre that they are doing this with taxpayers' money. And it seems to me a line has been crossed. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, it's well, it's one of the things that frustrates me about criminology, and that's kind of most of my kind of work is in that field, is that historically the areas of interest that you would focus on when you're looking at sort of criminalization in society would almost always have been, from a critical perspective, it would almost always have been those areas that you can see are being politicized and then prioritized by the police. Right? So, you know, sort of famous studies in the 1970s about mugging and how the police and the state, to a certain extent, became preoccupied with the issue of black people as potentially criminal, especially young black men, and you know, it's described as a moral panic and so on. Whereas here in Scotland, you get very much that. So you get, for example, something like domestic violence is highly politicized. It's made a top priority by the police. The police then have now a new form of guidance and framework to operate in relation to that. And that should be something that criminologists think, oh, we should have a look at this, because there's a potential for miscarriage of justice here. Right? And similarly around the hate crime framework, as you say, these posters, so for people who don't know, these posters went up everywhere around Scotland, and they would say things like, hey, bigot, we're onto you, we hate your hate. Right? And then they had another one about, if you're giving your sermon of hate, you know, we're onto you, which Christians challenged the government on this, and actually the Scottish government said, well, as a hate incident is meant to be anything that someone says is hateful, I'm telling you as a Christian that I think your posters are hateful towards Christians. And so you must accept that you, the Scottish state and the Scottish police, have committed a hate crime, or at least a hate incident from their own logic, which of course they rejected entirely and just tried to ignore that. But yes, so it's been fascinating that the police get involved in this. So you'll find examples in Glasgow where you get street preachers, when a group of young people come around and try and encourage the street preacher to say something homophobic while calling the police. And then you watch the videos on YouTube of these various street preachers getting arrested. And they haven't actually committed a crime, but they're arrested anyway. And then they're kept in the cells for sort of 8 hours, and then they're released. And then, you know, next time they're out, perhaps it'll happen again. So the police, there seems to be very little opposition to the police becoming essentially what would crudely be seen as politically correct and acting accordingly, not just in relation to law, but in relation to their guidance. And in fact, I would have to move away, but if I did, I've got if you go to police training college in Scotland, the first big manual you get, which is about 300 pages long, the first 56 pages of that manual are on diversity. Right? So the first 56 pages of training in the Scottish Police Training College is on diversity and diversity issues and how you should relate to diversity and how you should police and so on. And that's the framework of how new police officers are being trained within this kind of sensibility, if you like, of what is good and bad policing. So yes, I think it's right at the heart of the police. I think it's right at the heart of every institution, universities, police, social work, and so on. I think they all embody this kind of therapeutic and politically correct framework for what is acceptable and good practice.
Stuart, it's been really fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you to everybody who has taken the trouble to listen to this conversation. There's a huge amount of food for thought you've given me, certainly, and it's great to know that you and Jim Sillars and others are flying the flag for politically liberal values in Scotland. Thank you very much, Stuart Waiton.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.